keep playing it. I just want that nigun to sink into the world and take root. Such a beautiful new melody from Rabbi Baruch Chait. How's everybody doing? It's a Sunday, and it's a double daf today. Going to be covering 2 pages because I cannot be with you tomorrow night. Nina and I are going to be guests at a Sheva Brachos dinner. So we're just not able to be here tomorrow night. We'll be celebrating my good friend's nephew's wedding party. So double daf tonight. We'll stay on schedule since we're doing the double. And what's nice about that is that means that tonight are episodes 799 and 800. Hitting a milestone. This is the 800th episode of AT Daily. Great to be learning together. I'd like to dedicate our learning tonight, a double daf, so perhaps a double merit, to the healing of Rabbi Danielle Katz. I just a few minutes ago read such a personal and frightening post from Rabbi Katz. I mean, a lot of people have learned with him over the years. He's a gifted teacher. He puts a lot of material online. He's based in Israel. I actually met him personally in Medjugorje, right? Of all places, we met in Ukraine by the kever, accidentally. And there's no accidents, but we happened to meet after Uman. I'm sure he was at Uman, and then like a lot of people, we were traveling around, going to the grave, the final resting place of several tzaddikim. So Medjugorje is where the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism, is buried, and I happened to run into Rabbi Katz there, but we'd interacted online several other times. And he's just a wonderful, beautiful soul who teaches in a way that lifts up everybody. And I had no idea, but he shared on this Facebook post on his page. If you know him, go to his page, Rabbi Danielle Katz, the terrible difficulties he's been going through for the last 2 years, like one episode after another. Big physical challenges. I'm not sharing something he wants the public to know. That was his point in the Facebook post. So big, health challenges, but also an unbelievable number of weird coincidences of terrible troubles, getting his teachings online, getting donations to his nonprofit. People set up to make a whole big thing, and then their whole business dies on the day they were going to support Rabbi Katz, and then the person died going online, and then everything, just gets canceled electronically. There's a word for that when you're trying to get to Uman, to be by Rabbi Nachman's grave. It's menios, right? These difficulties. You run into these terrible menios. It's just part of when you're trying to do something really good. It's like the dark side rises up against you to impede your progress, and you just have to redouble your efforts to make a Kiddush Hashem, to do something that's for good in the world and to sanctify and glorify God's name in the world. It's never going to be easy. But the sheer number and degree of difficulties that Rabbi Katz has encountered in his last 2 years was just like my jaw was on the floor. So we're dedicating our learning tonight in this double daf on our 799th and 800th episode of AT Daily to the healing. May it be speedy and complete of Rabbi Danielle Katz. And we say Amen. Please join me in praying for his complete and speedy healing. Welcoming tonight, Shandora in the Bronx, Nancy in North Carolina, Yehuda in South Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Pauline in Arkansas, Stephen in New Hampshire, Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Lucy in Minnesota, Paul in Chicago, Gwen in Michigan, James in Indianapolis, John in Sedona, Melissa in Great Neck, Aaron, where's he checking in from? Just wishing us a shalom. Amy in Oregon. And Sharon says, boo-hoo, no daf on my birthday. You're getting it today, and your birthday starts tonight, right, Sharon? There you go. Patrice in Utah, Bella in Texas, Miriam in Hayden, Colorado, Dorothy in Pittsburgh, Yosef with us in Lowell, Paula, I think, praying for life for Rabbi Danielle, Janice adding to the prayers, lots of amens and people praying. Please pray, right? It's not, don't just say amen to me. Let's take a moment, right? Let's just take a moment. Please, God, send a healing, speedy and complete for Rabbi Danielle Katz. I mean, this guy really puts himself out there for his students, for everybody who's learning from him. Please, God, heal him. Okay. And over there on the YouTube side, Faith with us from Grants Pass, Oregon, and Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. All right, lots to cover because we're doing the double daf tonight. As I mentioned, Nina and I can't be here tomorrow night because we're attending a simcha, a beautiful Sheva Brachas dinner. You make 7 parties, as it were, in the week that somebody gets married. And our dear friend Michael and Suri, their nephew, is getting married, and they're making the Sheva Brachas for them. All right, so we pick this up at the bottom of 5b. And what's really interesting here, I mean, we're in Tractate 14 of the Talmud, Yevamos, right? And we're talking, these are the laws of a brother stepping in when his brother died, married but childless, to perform the mitzvah of Yibum, which would override the prohibition for a brother to ever marry a woman who was married to his brother at some point, right? It's only because the brother died childless. Otherwise, this widow would be prohibited to the Yavam, the brother who becomes obligated in this way, either to marry her in Yibum or for the two of them to perform the ceremony of Chalitza. So we see here that there's a positive commandment to marry your brother's widow when he dies childless, coming to override the negative commandment, the prohibition on marrying your brother's wife. And so we've been spending some time as the sages are trying to prove that this is so, that this positive commandment will override the negative commandment, that this is a general principle, that positive commandments override negative commandments when there is a conflict. And we basically prove that from tzitzis and shatnez, right? That even though it's prohibited to wear a garment made of wool and linen together in the garment, nevertheless, you would put a wool tzitzis with sky blue dye in the tzitzis on a linen garment, and we learn that from the juxtaposition of those commandments in the book of Deuteronomy. And we tried several other proofs that didn't work. That's the one that has held up. Now the sages are examining the question, okay, well, what if the negative commandment, the prohibition, is of a more severe degree, right? What if it bears the penalty of death at the hands of the heavenly court? Does the positive commandment still come and override it? And how do we know that? Because what we saw is it's going to override the prohibition on marrying your brother's wife, but it will not override the prohibition on marrying 2 sisters. So if 2 brothers marry 2 sisters, one of the brothers dies, in that situation, it's just the brother cannot marry the widow because then he would have 2 wives who are sisters. And that negative commandment does not get overridden. So what's beautiful about these 2 pages that we're doing now is just watching the sages work to find where we get the proof for this principle, how they derive a decree. Like a rabbinic decree does not add to the mitzvahs, but it does create halacha, right? So a rabbinic decree is distinct from a God-given commandment, but it is law, right? And so the sages are going to be very careful when they tell us that we must follow a law that wasn't originally included in the Torah, but is necessary so that we can fulfill our obligations in the Torah. So they're adding to the laws, but they're going to be very careful about doing it, and they're going to examine every possibility and alternative to creating a new law, and they're going to make absolutely sure that their act isn't just for the purpose of a policy consideration that they think would be important to fulfill, but that it is rooted in the commandments, and it's just, their decree is going to be necessary for us to fulfill the commandments, and there's a textual anchor for that decree. All right, we pick it up at the bottom of 5b. The Gemara is analyzing a baraisa. Where we left off yesterday, right, is in this case where what if, your parent, your mother or your father, tells you to, carry something through the public domain, or to use an animal to do work, or to slaughter, or to perform any of the prohibited labors on Shabbos, labors that are prohibited on Shabbos. What if one of your parents tells you to do that? Right? So you have a commandment to fulfill the word of your parents. That's the fifth commandment, right? Honor your mother and father. But if your mother or father tells you to do something that desecrates Shabbos, are you going to fulfill the positive commandment to honor your parents by doing what they ask you to do? Nina opened the door. I get the message. Okay. Let's light up the darkness. Are you going to do the positive commandment of honoring your parents if it means setting aside the negative commandment not to do labor on Shabbos? And the answer is no, right? No, that positive commandment does not override the negative commandments to do no labor on Shabbos. Now that we're talking about this, so is it not referring to a situation where his father said to him, slaughter for me, cook for me, or any other labor prohibited on Shabbos on pain of kares? Like, for example, when Isaac said to his son Asaph, go hunt for me and bring an animal for me and cook it for me and feed me, right? So that then I'll give you your blessing. And then, of course, it was Jacob, who sort of took on a disguise and came in and took that blessing from Asaph. Now, I'm not saying that happened on Shabbos. It didn't happen on Shabbos. But just as an example, if a father said, go hunt for me, catch for me, trap for me, because they wouldn't kill it in the field. So trap an animal, shecht the animal, right? Slaughter in a kosher manner, cook it, and serve it to me all on Shabbos. I mean, feeding your parents, when they ask you for something special to make it for them, that's a beautiful way to honor your parents. But you cannot do that if they say, do it on Shabbos. So here, slaughter for me, cook for me, or any other labor prohibited on Shabbos on pain of kares, right? That the penalty for violating Shabbos, for some of these penalties, some of these violations is kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court. And the reason that the merciful one specifically writes, keep my Shabboses, is to warn against violating the prohibition against performing labor on Shabbos, a transgression which incurs kares, for the purpose of honoring one's parents. We don't do it, and the reason that God included this extra phrase in the Torah, keep my Shabbos, is to teach you that no positive commandment is going to come in and uproot the negative commandments of not doing labor on Shabbos. It may therefore be inferred that if that was not so, if it hadn't been included, then the positive mitzvah would override Shabbos. It is therefore possible to deduce from here that in general, positive mitzvahs override even prohibitions that entail kares. And the Gemara rejects this proof. No! The reference is not to a situation where a father demanded that his child perform prohibited labor on Shabbos that entails kares. Rather, the parent instructed him to transgress the prohibition against driving a laden animal. Also, you can't do on Shabbos. Now, although it is prohibited to cause animals to work on Shabbos, this does not entail the penalty of kares, as it has the status of a regular prohibition, which might, if you violate it and you've been warned not to, you would receive lashes. And this shows that if one's father told him to desecrate Shabbos by driving a donkey, even so, the positive mitzvah to honor one's parents does not override the prohibition against driving a laden animal. So now it would seem, well, wait a minute. If we're talking about just violating a regular prohibition, so maybe this is going to now uproot what we learned from tzitzis and shatnez, that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah as long as it isn't a heavy prohibition. We were trying to prove that a positive mitzvah will override even a negative mitzvah that bears the penalty of kares. Now, from this teaching, we're seeing that a positive mitzvah doesn't even override a negative mitzvah that doesn't have a kares penalty. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, rather than that principle in which we maintain that a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a prohibition, let us derive from here that it does not override even a regular prohibition. Just as it was inferred above from the case of tzitzis, ritual fringes, in which the positive mitzvah overrides the prohibition against diverse kinds, that all other positive mitzvahs similarly override any prohibition, well, perhaps one should now infer from the case of honoring one's parents that you don't do that to, you don't allow that to allow you to desecrate Shabbos in any way, and therefore positive mitzvahs do not override negative mitzvahs. And if you say that one should not infer this from here, as the prohibitions of Shabbos are different, okay, so even though it's not a kares-bearing penalty to drive a laden animal on Shabbos, still it involves Shabbos, and Shabbos is one of the 10 commandments after all. So if you say one should not infer this from here, as the prohibitions of Shabbos are different in that they are more serious, and for this reason, the mitzvah to honor one's parents does not override these prohibitions because they're related to Shabbos, well, this cannot be the case. As the rabbi speaks generally, the rabbi of our Baraisa speaks generally of a father who instructs his son to perform a regular prohibition, not to desecrate Shabbos, and he does not raise any difficulty of this kind. As it is taught in another Baraisa, one might have thought that if one's father said to his son, who is a priest or a nazir, one who took an oath not to benefit from the grape vine. So if the parent said to him, be rendered ritually impure, become tameh, with the tuma, the impurity imparted by a corpse, so as to bring me an item from a ritually impure place, or if the parent said to him, do not return this lost item, so it might have been supposed that this son should obey him. Okay, now we're not talking about Shabbos at all, but we know that the laws of a priest, a Kohen, or a Nazir, while he's under a priest all his life, but a Nazir while he's subject to the vow that he took to be a Nazir, cannot attend a funeral even for a close relative, although they do make themselves tameh, ritually impure through corpse tuma, the most severe form of tuma, to bury a corpse that nobody else is there to bury, right? The mace mitzvah. So if you find an unattended corpse, no matter who you are, no matter what commandments apply to you, because you're a priest or a nazir, for that unattended corpse, you make yourself tameh and you take care of that corpse and bury it. But even for a close relative, if somebody else can bury it, you don't make yourself tameh. Okay, but what if your parent says to you, make yourself tameh, touch the corpse because I want you to do something for me that would require you're touching the corpse? Does the priest or the nazir obey his father and honor his parents and observe that commandment and thereby overrule the negative commandment incumbent upon him not to make himself tameh even for a close relative? Or there's the mitzvah to return a lost item. Big important mitzvah in the Torah. If you find a lost item, you have a biblical obligation to do your best to return it to its owner. And every time you find something lost and arrange for that lost item to make its way back to the owner, you fulfill a beautiful biblical commandment. Okay, but if the parent says to him, don't return this lost item, it might have been supposed that this son should obey him, because the positive mitzvah overrides the negative mitzvah. Therefore, the verse states, you shall fear every man, his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Shabboses. So this verse operates as one. Right? You will fear, you will honor your parents, and you will keep my Shabboses, meaning you will honor your parents as long as it doesn't require you to violate Shabbos. And from the commandment that as long as it doesn't require you to violate Shabbos, they're going to learn out. We're going to extend that principle to other negative mitzvahs. Honor your parents unless they tell you to violate a negative commandment, then you don't do that. You don't listen to them. So this verse teaches all of you are obligated in my honor, in God's honor. And this proves that the rabbi of the Mishna, the Tana, does not differentiate between desecrating Shabbos, which is a severe prohibition, and a priest becoming ritually impure with impurity imparted by a corpse, which is a lighter prohibition. Rather, the Gemara rejects this line of reasoning and accepts the claim that the Baraisa does not speak of one whose father asked him to desecrate Shabbos by performing a prohibited labor that entails charis, but rather of a father who instructed his son to drive a laden animal. As for the difficulty that this apparently indicates that a positive mitzvah does not override any type of prohibition, the reason that this is not the case is because there is room to refute that argument. And the Gemara explains how the previous claim can be countered. Right, the Torah teaches, honor your parents and keep my Shabbos. The Torah is not saying to you, therefore, positive mitzvahs do not override negative mitzvahs. And how do we know that? This is how the Gemara explains that. What about the fact that these instructions of a father are different? As when one drives an animal on Shabbos in honor of his parents, well, this is merely preparation for the mitzvah of honoring one's parents, since the son is not actually feeding or clothing his father at the time. So here we're learning that really, you want to honor your parents in every way, but like the most direct way is like, especially when they get old and they need your help the way you needed help when you were a little baby. Sometimes when our parents really get old, they need help feeding and clothing themselves, and that's the highest form of honoring your parents. So if you're driving a laden animal on Shabbos, you're not really doing that. You're just maybe doing some kind of an activity that is necessary to get you to the point where you could feed your parent, your aged parent, on Shabbos. So rather, it could enter your mind to say the principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition that entails charis is derived from a whole different area, from the building of the temple. As it is taught in a Baraisa, one might have thought that the building of the temple should override Shabbos. Therefore, the verse states, "You shall keep my Shabbos and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord," Leviticus 19:30, which means that all of you are obligated in my honor. God is honored when Shabbos is observed. When Jews keep Shabbos, God is honored, right? Whenever we do mitzvahs, whenever we do what God told us to do, we honor God. If you're not Jewish, there are 7 Noahide commandments. Anytime you fulfill any one of those commandments, and there's lots of, they're more like categories of commandments, but like the first commandment is to know God, to relate with God. So anytime you're doing this kind of learning like you're doing here, you're honoring God. But let's continue. As it's taught in Rabbi, so one might have thought that building the temple should override Shabbos. Therefore, the verse states, "You shall keep my Shabbos and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord," which means that all of you are obligated in my honor. God is honored when Shabbos is observed, and he demands the observance of Shabbos even when the temple is being built. Just a dry mouth. Nina, if you're listening, please bring me a glass of water. Thanks so much. Okay, so that we keep Shabbos even when the temple is being built and when the tabernacle was being built. In fact, when the instructions of building the tabernacle were originally given, the commandment to keep Shabbos was given again. And from that we learned that even for the purpose of building God's house in this world, we stop on Shabbos. Now the Gemara analyzes this Baraisa. What, is it not referring to building the temple by performing prohibited labors on Shabbos, whose violation entails charis, such as building and demolishing? Those are directly prohibited labors on Shabbos. And the reason the building of the temple does not override Shabbos is that the Merciful One specifically writes, "Keep my Shabbos." Thank you so much, honey. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol nihi b'divro. Okay. Is that the Merciful One writes, "Keep my Shabbos," from which it may be inferred that if it were not so, then the positive mitzvah would override Shabbos. But since God specifically said, no, building the temple doesn't override Shabbos when he said, "Keep my Shabbos," okay, so then building the temple doesn't override Shabbos. But otherwise it would, and that's why God said, again, keep my Shabbos. And so therefore, this actually is consistent with the principle that positive mitzvahs override negative mitzvahs. And the Gemara responds, no. Here too, the reference is to the prohibition against driving a laden animal. And even so, the positive mitzvah to build a temple does not override the prohibition against driving a laden animal on Shabbos. And the Gemara asks again, as before, well, if so, rather than the principle in which we maintain that a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a prohibition, let us derive from here that it does not override even a regular prohibition, let alone a prohibition with a chorus penalty. And if you say that prohibitions of Shabbos are different in that they are more severe, well, this cannot be the case, as the Tana speaks generally, and he does not raise any difficulty of this kind, as it is taught in the aforementioned Baraisa. Now, one might have thought that if one's father said to his son, who is a priest or a Nazir, be rendered ritually impure, or if he said to him, do not return this lost item, it might have been supposed that his son should obey his father. Therefore, the verse states, you shall fear every man his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Shabbos. I am the Lord your God, which means all of you are obligated in my honor, and you keep Shabbos even if your parents tell you to violate. Rather, there is no proof from here with regard to all Torah prohibitions, because there is room to refute that argument as follows. What about the fact that these instances of driving an animal on Shabbos are merely a preparation for the mitzvah of building the temple, and it is not a mitzvah in itself? And the Gemara raises a difficulty. Well, let the law that preparation for a mitzvah does not override a prohibition be derived from there, the case of honoring one's parents, as stated previously. Why repeat this matter with regard to the building of the temple? It seems like it's the same teaching. You're saying if your parent teaches you to drive a laden animal, a kind of lesser penalty for that, on Shabbos, that you don't do it. But we already learned that from your parents saying it to you. Why do we need to know that you don't drive a laden animal to continue the work of the temple on Shabbos? And the Gemara responds, yes, it is indeed so. And why do I need the verse, you shall keep my Shabbos and revere my sanctuary? After all, the law that the building of the temple does not override the prohibition against driving an animal on Shabbos is derived from the case of honoring one's parents. Why is it necessary? The Gemara answers, it is necessary to derive that which is taught in another Baraisa. One might have thought that a person should be in reverence of the temple and turn the temple itself into an object of worship. Therefore, the verse states, you shall keep my Shabbos and revere my sanctuary. And putting Shabbos and the sanctuary together, why? The term keeping is stated with regard to Shabbos, and the term reverence is stated with regard to the temple. Now, just as the case of keeping stated with regard to Shabbos, you do not revere Shabbos itself, as reverence is not mentioned in this context, but rather one reveres he who warned about the observance of Shabbos. So too, the same applies to the reverence stated with regard to the temple. You do not revere the temple itself, but he who warned about the temple. Very important teaching here, right? Judaism is very much a religion of action, right? Of actions, that we are commanded to do all manner of things and to refrain from all manner of actions. And when we do that, we honor God thereby. But we shouldn't somehow start to revere the actions themselves. If we're so privileged to live in a generation that has the Holy Temple standing in Jerusalem, hey, that's an amazing, miraculous building where we go to love and honor God, not to love and honor the building. Right? Shabbos is an incredibly beautiful experience that we have every 7 days. We shut off the screens and watches and telephones and everything, and we just rest and enjoy the serenity and the blessings and our families. But it's not Shabbos that we worship, as it were. It's God. Shabbos is a setting to worship God, commune with God, feel God's blessing in our lives, right? God forbid we would come to worship, one of the objects or practices of Judaism. Everything is meant to connect us to God, right? So likewise, we don't worship the temple, we worship him who instructed us to build a temple. The Bryce explains, and what is the reverence of the temple? What does it mean to revere the temple? Right? Okay, it's a place where we revere God, but it says you shall revere my sanctuary. So what does that actually mean? In deference to the temple, a person may not enter the temple mount with his staff, his shoes, his money belt, or even the dust on his feet. One may not make the temple a shortcut to pass through it, and through a kal v'chomer inference, all the more so, one may not spit on the temple mount, as no disrespect is meant by the other actions, whereas spitting is repulsive even in one's own private home, and certainly not on the temple mount. So revere my sanctuary means treat it like a special place. Don't just take a shortcut through the temple mount. Don't enter there with dirty feet. Don't bring your money belt. Don't bring your staff. And you have to prepare for that encounter with the Lord and dress accordingly. After all, if you were given an audience with an earthly king, think how you would prepare for that and dress yourself up and practice your behavior, etc. All the more, that's the Kal v'chomer sequence, all the more must you do so when you're preparing to meet our heavenly king. And I've derived only that one is obligated to act in this manner, we're on 6b, when the temple is standing. From where do I derive that the mitzvah to revere the temple is in force when the temple is not standing? I.e., that it is prohibited to be disrespectful toward the place where the temple stood. Now, this is a time that we live in. We know where the temple stood. You go to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. It's considered the holiest place on earth to the Jewish people. And everybody who enters that prayer plaza at the wall, you feel something very powerful, and you're going to adopt, an absolute air of reverence. And as a matter of fact, we pray toward the temple every time we pray. So for most of us here in America, right, we're always facing east when we pray. Every synagogue is oriented so that you're facing east. If you were in a synagogue in South Africa, presumably the sanctuary is oriented so you're facing north. If you're in Asia, you're going to be facing west toward the sanctuary. So we certainly still revere it, even when the temple is not standing. From where do I derive that the mitzvah to revere the temple is enforced when the temple is not standing, i.e. that it is prohibited to be disrespectful toward the place where the temple once stood? The verse states, you shall keep my Shabbos and revere my sanctuary, just as the keeping stated with regard to Shabbos applies forever. Keeping Shabbos is forever. There will always be Shabbos. We'll always keep Shabbos. Just as the keeping stated with Shabbos applies forever, so too the reverence stated with regard to the temple is forever. Now, with regard to the issue at hand, the Gemara has not yet found an explanation as to why a specific inference was required to teach that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition when that prohibition incurs the more severe penalty of kares. Rather, it might enter your mind to say that this claim might be derived from the law of kindling. As the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught with regard to the verse, you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on the day of Shabbos. Exodus 35:3. Now, what is the meaning when the verse states this? As the general prohibition against performing labor on Shabbos appears elsewhere. Now, this is very interesting. Right? Already, it says you may do no manner of labor on Shabbos. Kindling a light is a form of labor that is prohibited on Shabbos. So the question is, if the Torah says you may do no labor on Shabbos, and that includes all the different categories of labor, in fact, we define them, the sages define elsewhere, in Tractate Shabbos, we learn what kinds of labor are prohibited on Shabbos, the kinds of labor that were needed to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. One of them was making a fire. There's all kinds of reasons why you might need to make a fire. So why is it that the Torah says you may not do any work on Shabbos and you may not kindle a light on Shabbos? Why add that? We already knew that you can't kindle a light on Shabbos from the commandment, do no labor on Shabbos. Why this extra specific prohibition? What is the meaning when the verse states that as a general prohibition against performing labor on Shabbos appears elsewhere, and now we're told don't kindle? So the Gemara expresses puzzlement at this question. What is the meaning when the verse states this? What kind of question is this? If the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, the verse comes to teach that one who kindles fire on Shabbos merely violates a regular prohibition, which does not entail the penalty of stoning, unlike other prohibited labors. It's to teach you that kindling is actually a less severe transgression. But if the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nassan, kindling was singled out to divide the various prohibited labors of Shabbos and to establish liability for the separate performance of each of them. Right? So if on the same Shabbos I kindled a light and I, did some construction and I wrote out, a receipt for a business deal, all prohibited labors, I would be liable to and need to atone for each of the transgressions. If I did it unwittingly, I would owe a sin offering for each of those transgressions. If I did it intentionally, I don't have the option to bring a sin offering when the temple is standing, but I'm going to have to atone for each separate transgression. And according to Rabbi Nassan, we learn that out from the fact that one of the labors was singled out. You may not kindle on Shabbos, as it is taught in a Baraisa. And Rava said, in explanation of the question asked by the school of Rabbi Yishmael, for this Tana, the term habitations poses a difficulty with regard to his opinion. The Baraisa should be understood as follows. What is the meaning when the verse states habitations? What additional inference is indicated by this term? When it said, you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on Shabbos day. Why does it say your habitations? It could have said you shall kindle no fire on Shabbos day. Why did the Torah include you shall kindle no fire in your habitations? So Rav is commenting on that. So what is the meaning when the verse states habitations? What additional inference is indicated by this term, which might lead to the erroneous conclusion that this Shabbos prohibition applies only in certain places of habitation and not others? And the Gemara explains why habitations cannot mean that Shabbos observance only applies in certain places but not in others. You can't kindle a light anywhere on Shabbos. So why is habitations there? What are we going to learn from it? Since Shabbos is an obligation that applies to the body, i.e. to the individual himself, and not to an external object, and there is a principle that obligations of the body apply both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel, then why do I need the term habitations that the Merciful One writes with regard to Shabbos? A student said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael that since it is stated, and if a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is put to death, Deuteronomy 21:22, I would derive that the death penalty is administered whether on a weekday or on a Shabbos. We're going to bring this all back together, but we're bringing in various laws to help, create the proof. So here we have a situation where, somebody committed a death penalty offense. He was tried in the Beis Din, right, before the rabbinic court. If it's a death penalty offense, when the temple was standing, it was the whole Sanhedrin, right, the court of 70, or 71, so they have an odd number. And they found him guilty. So now he stands to be executed. Here's the problem. When a rabbinic court finds you guilty of a transgression, that punishment is the death penalty, so you get the death penalty that day. There's no death row for decades, right? So if you were found guilty of this crime on Shabbos, well, then they should execute you on that very day, and it's Shabbos. But slaughtering a person violates the prohibition of doing labor on Shabbos. So I would derive that the death penalty is administered, whether it's on a weekday or on Shabbos. And how do I establish the verse? And you shall keep Shabbos, for it is sacred to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. This verse applies to other prohibited labors, except for court-imposed capital punishment, which must be administered even on Shabbos. Or perhaps it is only the case that even court-imposed capital punishment is included in the list of prohibited labors on Shabbos. How then do I establish the verse? And he is put to death. This is referring to a weekday and not to Shabbos. How do I know that? Surprisingly, the Tana reverts back to his earlier claim. Or perhaps it is only the case that capital punishments may be administered even on Shabbat. Therefore, the verse states by way of a verbal analogy, you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on the Shabbos day. And below it says at the end of the chapter dealing with murderers, and these things shall be for you a statute of judgment to you throughout your generations in all your habitations. That's why we're talking about this, because it has the phrase, in all your habitations. Just as the term habitations stated below in the book of Numbers with regard to the laws of capital crimes means in the court. So, the word habitations doesn't mean to your home. It means to your courtroom, okay? So it means in the court where judgment is performed. So too the term habitations stated here means in the court, i.e. in the place where judges preside. And the merciful one states in the Torah, you shall kindle no fire. Since one of the court-imposed death penalties is burning, which is performed by kindling fire, then evidently court-imposed death penalties do not override Shabbos. With the above conclusion in mind, the Gemara comments, what, is it not the case that the opinion of the school of Rabbi Yishmael is in accordance with that of Rabbi Nassan, who said that the prohibition against kindling fire was singled out to divide, and to say that each time you do something that is a transgression of Shabbos, you are liable for each separate transgression, not all of the different transgressions of Shabbos that you might do on one Shabbos count as one transgression. And if so, the reason why capital punishments are not administered on Shabbos is that the merciful one writes, you shall kindle no fire, from which it may be inferred that if it were not so, then court-imposed capital punishment would override Shabbos. In other words, the positive mitzvah of a legal execution, right, executing a murderer after he's been tried and found guilty, would override the prohibition against lighting fire on Shabbos, which incurs charis. It would have, except that God made a specific clause in the Torah to tell you not to do that. The Gemara rejects this proof. No, this is not a proof, as it can be claimed that the opinion of the Tana from the school of Rabbi Yishmael is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, that kindling fire is actually an ordinary prohibition. It's a lesser prohibition than the other labors that would violate Shabbos. And the Gemara retorts, and let it even be according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. You could say that when Rabbi Yosef said that kindling was singled out as a prohibition, he was referring to kindling alone, i.e. that lighting a regular fire is only a regular prohibition. But lighting an execution fire or lighting something else, that's something different. Conversely, the kindling by the court for the execution of a convicted murderer, for example, and he is going to be punished with burning, is actually the cooking of a leaden wick. Now, to explain for 1 second, I'll let Rav Steinsaltz explain it. Since execution by burning involves melting or cooking a piece of lead called a wick and pouring it into the mouth of the convict, it therefore constitutes the prohibited labor of cooking, which is a different prohibition than simply kindling fire to make a light. So we just learned, by the way, when you talk about burning as a Torah-imposed death penalty, we don't mean burning at the stake, like the Romans did, and like they did in the witch trials, in earlier centuries, even here on the American shore. Burning, when it's a court-imposed death penalty by a Torah, by a rabbinic court, you're still going to die. It's terrible. But they're going to melt lead and pour it down your throat. That's what burning means. How do they know that? They derive that somewhere else. The point here is, well, it might be the death penalty, but it's essentially cooking. And that's what's prohibited. And then we're going to separate that from kindling a light. As Rav Sheshes said in this regard, what difference is there to me between cooking a wick, which is performed by court-imposed capital punishment, and what difference is there to me between the cooking of herbs used to dye curtains for the tabernacle, from whose work the list of prohibited labors on Shabbos is derived? Since the court-imposed death penalty involves the prohibited labor of cooking, which according to all opinions incurs charis, so even according to Rabbi Yosef, who says that kindling is a lesser prohibition, it's not a charis-bearing penalty. Okay, but cooking a wick for the death penalty, that's like cooking to dye the cloths of the tabernacle, definitely prohibited and a charis-bearing penalty. So this apparently indicates that without the special verse that renders this prohibited, one would have said that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition for which one is liable to receive kares. Like we've proven that positive mitzvahs override negative mitzvahs, even ones that have a kares penalty, unless the Torah specifically says that this particular positive mitzvah doesn't override this negative mitzvah. But the Gemara rejects this argument as well. Rav Shimi bar Ashi said, the Tana does not raise the possibility that a court-administered death penalty might override Shabbos because a positive mitzvah comes to override a prohibition. Rather, he entertains this option because he learns this by means of a kal v'chomer inference. And this is what he is saying. How do I establish the verse, everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death, Exodus 31:14. Now this applies to other prohibited labors except for court-imposed capital punishment. However, it could be said that court-imposed capital punishment overrides Shabbos by the kal v'chomer's inference. We're on 7a now. If the temple service, which includes the sacrifice of offerings, is so severe that it overrides Shabbos, as offerings were brought on Shabbos, right? We do have a daily offering that is brought even on Shabbos. And yet, the law of murder, the law of the murderer overrides even the temple service, i.e. the obligation to execute a sentenced convict overrides the temple service. As it is stated with regard to one sentenced to death, you shall take him even from the altar that he may die. Then in the case of Shabbos, which is overridden by the temple service, is it not right that the laws of executing a murderer would override it? Right? The law of executing a murderer overrides the temple service. The temple service overrides Shabbos. Therefore, the law of executing the murderer overrides Shabbos. Right? The Gemara analyzes a puzzling statement in the above baraisa. But what is the meaning of the claim? Or perhaps it is only the case that capital punishments may be administered even on Shabbos, which the Tana stated in an unexplained reversion to his previous suggestion. The Gemara explains that this is what he is saying. The kal v'chomer reasoning can be refuted as the obligation to bury a corpse with no one available to bury it, the mace mitzvah, the unattended corpse, can prove otherwise, as the obligation to bury a mace mitzvah overrides the temple service, right? A priest who's choosing whether to become impure and not be able to serve in the temple, or a priest who must choose to bury the unattended corpse and become impure and therefore be unfit to serve in the temple, or go do his job in the temple, has to choose to bury the mace mitzvah. So in that sense, burying the mace mitzvah overrides the temple service. So let me get it right. Right. So the kal v'chomer can be refuted as the obligation to bury a corpse with no one available to bury it. The mace mitzvah can prove otherwise, as the obligation to bury a mace mitzvah overrides the temple service, and yet it does not override Shabbos. Right? So if you find an unattended corpse on Shabbos, okay, it's going to be up to you to bury it, but you don't bury it on Shabbos. It can wait till the next morning. So the Tana then retracted his statement and said that one can claim that the burial of a mace mitzvah overrides Shabbos by means of the same kal v'chomer inference. If the temple service overrides Shabbos and the burial of a mace mitzvah overrides the temple service, maybe we should bury the mace mitzvah on Shabbos. Now the Gemara pauses in the middle of the kal v'chomer inference to explain this last point. This is derived from the superfluous phrase, or for his sister, in the verse, he shall not make himself ritually impure. This is about the priest or the Nazir. He shall not make himself ritually impure, not for his father or his mother, for his brother or for his sister when they die. He will not allow himself to become tameh, even to bury his mother, father, brother, or sister. Now this is referring to the Nazir. This verse teaches that even a Nazir on his way to sacrifice the Pesach, the Paschal lamb, must render himself impure to bury a mace mitzvah. Not for his close relatives, but yes, for the unattended corpse. And the Gemara resumes the a fortiori inference. So if so, As Shabbos is overridden by the temple service, is it not right that the burial of the Mace Mitzvah should override it? Therefore, God includes a verse in the Torah, you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on Shabbos day, is to teach us that we don't violate Shabbos for anything. Except we do it for a bris, except we do it for the daily offering. So unless it says you can do it, only then do you violate Shabbos. But unless there's an express exemption to do a particular positive mitzvah on Shabbos, otherwise we don't. So this concludes Rav Shimi Bar Ashi's interpretation of the Baraisa, that the Tana suggested that a court-administered death penalty might override Shabbos, not because of the principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition, but due to a potential kal v'chomer inference. And so the Gemara asks, and according to that which entered his mind at the outset, that the assumption of the Tana was indeed based on the principle that a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a prohibition, what is the meaning of the clause when he says, or perhaps it is only in the case that the capital punishments may be administered even on Shabbos that the Tana spoke? How should the Baraisa be explained according to our initial interpretation? The Gemara explains, this is what the Tana is saying. It would have been possible to say the following. How do I establish the verse, everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death, about Shabbos? This applies to other prohibited labors, but for court-imposed capital punishment, no. However, court-imposed capital punishment does override Shabbos as a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a prohibition. The Tana was saying, you might have thought that. The Tana then retracted this statement, and he said, you can say that we started the principle that a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a prohibition, yet this is true for a regular prohibition alone. However, did you hear that it overrides a prohibition that includes kares, the kares penalty? The Tana then said, hinting at a counterclaim, is that not to say, with regard to the principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition, that the prohibition is more stringent than the positive mitzvah? After all, the court punishes one who violates a prohibition with lashes, which is not the case for a failure to uphold a positive mitzvah. And yet, by Torah law, the positive mitzvah comes and overrides the prohibition, which would seem to be more stringent than the positive mitzvah. If so, what difference is it to me if it is a case of a minor stringency, and what difference is it to me if it is a major stringency? Once the Torah has stated that a positive mitzvah supersedes a prohibition, there should be no difference between a relatively stringent prohibition and a lenient one. Therefore, the verse states, you shall not kindle. In sum, the Gemara has not found a clear proof for the opinion that a positive mitzvah supersedes a prohibition if that prohibition has a kares penalty associated with it. Consequently, the Gemara suggests a different interpretation. The superfluous phrase, with her, indeed teaches the obligation of yibum, levirate marriage, does not override the prohibition with regard to women with whom relations are forbidden. This is where we started this tractate, right? That the surviving brother marries the widow of his dead brother if his brother died childless, even though he's prohibited to marry his brother's wife. But it does not override that prohibition if the brother's wife is also the sister of his own wife, because you can't be married to two sisters. It doesn't override if his brother's wife happened to have been his daughter, she married her uncle. It doesn't override if his brother's wife happens to be his granddaughter or his wife's child, right? It's like his stepson or his stepdaughter. Then he cannot marry her in all those situations. So if there's any other of these familial relations, the positive mitzvah does not override. Okay, that's where we started, and we're still trying to prove that. So, however, the derivation is required not because one might have thought that a positive mitzvah supersedes a prohibition that incurs kares. Rather, this phrase is necessary because it could enter your mind to say, let this case of a brother's wife, to whom the mitzvah of yibum applies, be treated in accordance with a well-established hermeneutical principle, a principle of deriving laws from Scripture, a matter that was included in a generalization, but emerged to teach not just about itself, but to teach about the entire generalization, right? We've seen this idea. You cannot do any labor on Shabbos. And then the Torah says you shall not kindle a light in any of your habitations. Well, that's already included in the generalization. Why did the Torah include this specific example of the generalization when you already said do no labor? Why did the Torah include the specific example? From this kind of structure in the Torah, our sages have established methods of learning what it is that God is trying to tell us and creating a law out of it, right? And so one of these methods is from a matter that was included in a generalization, but emerged to teach, right? A specific example of the generalization was given to teach us something. It emerged to teach not just about itself, that's one example, you cannot light a fire in your homes, but rather to teach about the entire generalization. The fact that you shall not kindle in your habitations was added by God as an example. It's for a reason, and it's to teach us something about that whole law, no labor on Shabbos. And the Gemara explains the application of this principle to our current case. Now, since the prohibition prescribing a brother's wife is included in the general prohibition with regard to women with whom relations are forbidden, you may not marry your brother's wife. It can be claimed that the law of Yibum, you shall marry your brother's wife if your brother died childless. It can be claimed that the law of Yibum renders not only a brother's childless wife permitted, but in this case, it renders permitted all women with whom relations are usually forbidden. As it is taught in a Baraisa that clarifies this principle, a matter that was included in a generalization, but emerged to teach not just about itself, but to teach about the entire generalization. How so? So the Baraisa provides an example of this principle by citing a verse. But the soul that eats of the flesh of the sacrifice of peace offerings that belong to the Lord, with his ritual impurity upon him, that soul shall be cut off from his people. Right? So if somebody brings an offering, like we were just studying Tractate Chagiga, so if you bring a festival peace offering, part of it goes up on the altar, the rest is eaten by the owner and his friends. If the owner brings that offering to the temple and he enters the temple and he is tameh, he's in a state of ritual impurity, he didn't tell anybody, it's a big sin. And then he eats of that offering. So that's another sin. A sin to enter the temple when you're impure, and a sin to eat of an offering, a sacred offering, while you are in a state of ritual impurity. Okay? But aren't peace offerings included in the general category of all consecrated offerings? We already learned that a person cannot eat of any consecrated food if he is tameh. Why are we now being told you cannot eat of the peace offerings if you are tameh? And why were they explicitly singled out from the rest in the above verse? Why? To draw an analogy between them and to say to you, just as peace offerings are unique in that they are consecrated for the altar, so too this halacha, this law, that one who eats of them is liable to receive kares, applies to all food that is consecrated for the altar, which excludes objects that are consecrated for the temple maintenance, right? We learned in Shekalim, Tractate Shekalim, that every year you would donate some money when the temple was standing for the upkeep of the temple. That money that you gave, a kind of tax on everybody, that's consecrated money. But that's different than money used to purchase offerings, right? It's different. So the above Baraisa, and you might have consecrated an animal for temple upkeep, right? So if you ate of that animal, first there's a different problem that you appropriated something for yourself that needed to go to the temple. But if you ate it while you were impure, that's not its own separate transgression the way it would if you ate of a peace offering while you were impure. So the above Baraisa provide an example of the principle that an item singled out from a general category teaches a law with regard to the entire category. So here too, one can argue, this case of a brother's wife. It was included in the general category of all women with whom relations are forbidden. And why was she singled out to compare to her and say to you, just as the childless brother's wife is permitted, so too all women with whom relations are forbidden are likewise permitted. And so maybe that's what the case of the brother's wife teaches us that all women who you would otherwise be prohibited, just like your brother's wife, if this woman ends up being the widow of your childless brother who died, then you can marry her. But no, it doesn't. We don't learn that. Only in the case of the brother's wife who has no other relation to you. So the Gemara raises an objection. How can you compare this? There, in the case cited as an example of this principle, that the specific example given among the generalization teaches something about the generalization. In this example that you gave, all offerings are included in the prohibition against eating offerings while you are ritually impure, tameh. And the detailed case of peace offerings is also included in the prohibition. Consequently, it can be said that the specific case was singled out to teach about the entire category. By contrast, here, in the case of Yibum, with forbidden relatives, the generalization is included in the prohibition against engaging in forbidden relations, and yet the detailed case is permitted. Therefore, it cannot be said that the detail has been singled out so as to clarify some aspect of the general category. Rather, this law differs from all the other women who might apply to. Instead, this case is comparable only to those that fit a different hermeneutical principle concerning a matter that was included in a generalization but emerged to discuss a new matter. Not this is an example of the generalization, but rather this is an exception of the generalization. So if a novel aspect or special ruling is taught with regard to a specific case within a broader general category, then you cannot return it to its generalization even for other matters, to the extent that this case has been entirely removed from the general category until the Torah explicitly returns it to its generalization. As it is taught in a baraisa with regard to a matter that was included in a generalization, but it emerged to discuss a new matter, you may not return it to its generalization until the Torah explicitly returns it to the generalization. How so? The baraisa provides an example of this principle. With regard to the guilt offering of a mitzvah, one who had tzaras and is recovering, and he's going to bring offerings at the end of his purification process. And the verse states, and he shall slaughter the sheep in the place where they slaughter the sin offering and the burnt offering, in the place of the sanctuary. For as the sin offering is the priest's, so is the guilt offering. Leviticus 14:13. And there is no need for the verse to state, as the sin offering, so is the guilt offering, since apparently this comparison does not teach anything new, because the laws of guilt offerings are already stated elsewhere, Leviticus 7. Then, what is the meaning when the verse states, as is the sin offering, so is the guilt offering? Since the guilt offering of the Mitzvah was specified from the general category of all guilt offerings to discuss a new matter, i.e. that the blood is placed on the thumb of the right hand and the big toe of the right foot. And one might have thought that this guilt offering does not require placement of the blood in sacrificial parts on the altar. For this guilt offering, the placement of blood on the mitzvah is sufficient. We don't have to get into those specifics. The point is that this was an exception, right? There's the general law of guilt offerings. Now the sin offering portion of the offerings brought by the mitzvah at the end of his purification process is compared to the guilt offerings. What? To say that it's done like all the guilt offerings? No, to say it might be similar to the guilt offerings, but it's treated in its own unique way, and it's an exception, not to teach us about how we're supposed to do all guilt offerings. 7b, and I'm almost done, so if you got any questions, get them in. Therefore, the verse states, as the sin offering, so is the guilt offering, to teach that just as the sin offering requires placement of the blood in sacrificial parts on the altar, so too the mitzvah's guilt offering requires placement of the blood in sacrificial parts on the altar. And the Gemara comments, and had the verse not explicitly restored this case of the guilt offering to its generalization, I would say, with regard to that which was excluded from the generalization, as a novel ruling in this case, it was excluded. And with regard to that which was not excluded, it was not excluded. And therefore, that case which was not excluded, it was not excluded. And therefore, the law would have been different in the various cases. And so here too, I would say a brother's wife who is permitted under the law of Yibum, she is permitted. Whereas the other women in the general category of prohibited relations are not thereby permitted because they also happen to be the wife of a brother who died childless. So we have the example of the brother's wife become permitted under the law of Yibum. That's an exception. It doesn't teach us that all these other women who are prohibited to a man because she's his daughter or his mother or his daughter-in-law or his granddaughter, all these other relationships that are prohibited to a man, they don't become permitted to him because she also became the wife of his brother and then the brother died childless. Only a woman who has no prohibited relation to the surviving brother is going to be rendered permitted to him under Yibum, and it's only the one relationship, you can't marry your brother's wife, which gets set aside for the law of Yibum, but no other prohibited relationships are set aside. That's where we finish today on 7b. And there's no class tomorrow because Nina and I are going to a simcha, to a Sheva Brachas celebration for our friend's family. Okay, so let me just get a couple of questions. I know we've been going a long time to do this double daf. Bill, would this connection between a court and the word habitation indicate that habitation means something akin to jurisdiction? I think it might, like we didn't go too deep on that because there it was just, sort of using one verse to learn a law that might apply in another context. And here, because it said, you shall not suffer a murderer to live in your habitations. And I'm sure I'm getting the wording wrong. But the point is that the term habitations was used in the law of murderers and it was used in you shall not kindle fire. The sages were able to make a connection and say, you will not impose a death penalty by burning, or actually any death penalty on Shabbos. And for that reason, a court, considering a capital case, would not meet not on Shabbos and not on Friday, in case they had to then, deliberate all night, and then, it became Shabbos, and then they would have to execute on Shabbos. For that very reason, the court would not meet neither on Shabbos nor the day before Shabbos, nor on a holiday, nor the day before a holiday. Right, PK, do the courts operate on Shabbos? No, for that reason. Elvis, I seem to recall learning that the execution of people for Shabbos violations was almost never done in practice. Right, so now we're talking about something different. Yes, it is a death penalty offense to violate Shabbos. Here we've been talking about charis, right? So charis is death at the hands of the heavenly court. Now, we did see that the wood gatherer in the desert, right, it was brought to Moses' attention and they took that person out and killed him. But no, I don't think that in the history of the Jewish people, anyone was ever actually executed by a court for violating Shabbos. It would really have to be that with two witnesses present, they came and said to him, if you do that, you're going to be liable to the death penalty. And then he did it right away. And then they brought this guy to the court. And he was tried by the witness, etc. But here we were talking about categories of law and whether the overarching question, does the positive mitzvah override negative mitzvah? Generally, yes. Does a positive mitzvah override a negative mitzvah that has a charis penalty associated with it? Sometimes. And finally, Charles, concerning the term discussed earlier, rival wife, which I'd rather say co-wife, I heard it explained that the reason why a co-wife is called a rival wife is because the privacy of one wife intrudes on the privacy of the other wife. I mean, I think they're called rival wives because the Torah is being very realistic. If you're going to have two wives, they're going to end up being in a rivalry with each other, as we learn from the case of two sisters, Rachel and Leah, right, who were married to Jacob, and they loved each other so much, right, that Rachel, rather than let Leah be humiliated, gave her the secret signs that she and Jacob had worked out, so that Rachel enabled Leah to marry her husband Jacob, who otherwise would have not gone through with it. So they super loved each other, and then they ended up, in a real bitter dispute with each other. And from there, the Torah then specifically said, you shall not have two wives who are sisters. They did that before the Torah was given, so they weren't violating a Torah prohibition. But I think it is realistic to say that co-wives become rival wives. And here in the Quran, they don't even say co-wives; they say rival wives. It's just, I just think taking the emotional aspect out of it. I think it's easier to track when we're talking about co-wives. We get, okay, these are two wives who are married to the same husband, right? And if we say rival wives, we mean the same thing. But just listening to the English, we might have thought that these are both guests on the show Real Housewives, right? So co-wives, I think, just summons the image more easily, more readily, that they're married to the same husband. But good point, Charles. That's what I've got for us today. No class tomorrow. We're ahead of schedule. And with God's help, we'll be together again on Tuesday for page 8. That's Tuesday. And then Wednesday night is Purim. So I think we'll be able to have a class Purim night, but we will not have a class on Purim day, Thursday. That's just not going to happen. We're going to a Purim Suda that begins at 4:30 and is going to go well into the night. So we won't have a class on Thursday. However, Thursday midday, noon Pacific, we'll have our annual reading of the Megillah. Nina and I will read the book of Esther, and we'll collect donations. They'll just flow through our nonprofit, but we will give them to the needy. So that'll be an opportunity for you to fulfill the mitzvah of giving money, and sustenance to the poor on Purim. So we'll make an announcement, but watch for our annual reading of the Megillah and collecting gifts for the poor at noon Pacific on Thursday. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. All the best.